We need to talk about inheritance.
I want it.
Talking about money has been called Britain's last taboo. It's claimed we would rather talk about sex to a stranger than our salary. I know talking about inheritance with loved ones can feel a bit insensitive, slightly morbid even, kind of like you're wishing them dead in a way. So for that reason, this video will feel uncomfortable at points. I recognise that. But between now and 2045, $90 trillion will move between generations. It's the largest wealth transfer in history, and it promises really to reshape the global economy. It threatens to entrench inequality, and if we're not careful, it's going to rip families apart. Don't you think that is worth talking about?
The largest wealth transfer in history has begun.
$105 trillion.
Who's the money for?
That is a great question. The percentage of individuals expecting to receive an inheritance rose from 72% of those born in the 1960s to 81% of those born in the 1980s. 1 in 7 young adults expect to inherit money before they're 35, although the typical age of inheritance is between 55 and 64. And this 2019 study revealed that UK adults on average expect to receive an inheritance windfall of £132,000. But expectations are often not reality.
The figures here are really all over the place. The most quoted data that I could find is from the ONS. It's 10 years old and it states that the average is around 50k. This could be a mean figure though, because I found other sources that quoted a median average of around 11k. So it might be somewhere between these two figures. Regardless, it's likely significantly lower than people expect.
If you're waiting around for an inheritance, the data suggests that you're going to wait longer than you suspected and you're going to get a lot less than you expected.
We, the generation, wait for the older ones to die, throwing all our hopes upon our parents' sad demise. We've no malice and no greed, it's just that Daddy's golden hoard is the only hope we've got.
Millennials have been dubbed Generation Wait, due to this belief that for many of them that they will need to wait for inheritances in order to achieve key financial milestones. This disconnect between expectation and reality is one that's worth exploring, and I hope by the end of this video to promote open conversation between generations. But let's look at this from the other end first of all, shall we? This table breaks down the wealth of parents of those who receive inheritances based on the decade that the individual was born, the 60s, the 70s and the 80s. We can see that the scale of wealth across that 30-year period that is set to be inherited is significantly larger in every part of the country. But you'll also notice that the makeup of that wealth, there are some trends. So physical wealth has increased. We all have more stuff than we did in the past. Financial wealth has increased in some areas, but not really all that significantly, especially when you compare it to property, which has gone mental. The dominant theme, the key wealth driver, unsurprisingly, has been home ownership.
I'm in a freezing cold Southport, pretty grey today, because I want to show you something.
This is the promenade. It was built in the 1800s to protect the high street from the sea. It's a tourist attraction and is one of the main draws to the Southport area. God knows why. From here, looking out, you have uninterrupted views of the Marine Lake, the pier, Matalan, and then the beach. So there are lots of apartment blocks on this road.
But a lot of properties on the prom, they share a similar characteristic. I mean, how do I put this? They cater to a certain demographic.
Southport's often called God's waiting room, due to the high proportion of elderly people who live here.
This right here is a prime example. Number 10 to 12 Promenade, or as it's known, the Promenade Care Home. A permanent residence here will set you back between £700 and £1,000 a week. 50 grand a year, £500,000 over 10 years. And the thing is, that's not even expensive when it comes to the care home game.
In January 2025, the average weekly fee for a residential care home was £1,387 and £1,545 for a nursing home. Support exists, but a lot of it is means tested. So it varies the thresholds based on where you live in the UK. But in England, say, if you have more than £23,250 in assets, you're deemed able to self-fund. So how are people meant to fund that level of care when their wealth looks like this? Well, it's simple really, isn't it? They sell their house. A key issue this raises for social policy is whether people maintain their assets to leave as bequests, potentially raising the living standards of their children, or they use them in later life to improve their own living standards. The definition of bequest is the act of giving or leaving something through a will or a trust.
What happens when the choice becomes leaving money to your kids or just simply living your life? There's a whole generation here that are relying on this money to fulfill their financial goals, potentially unaware that their parents might just need that money to live. I actually think there's parents out there that haven't considered this reality either.
I've seen one case recently, and it's the first time I've seen it creep in, where parents have paid children overpaid because they were in need, left themselves short, asked for the money back, not got it back, and are now suing
the kids
to repay the money back in again.
That is a tragic example on the extreme end, but as a parent, honestly, I can relate to how you could end up, overgiving or over-promising your kids something that then becomes unaffordable in later life when you have no ability to work anymore. Should we deny the elderly that right to live out their days in paradises such as this? Paying £800 a week for uninterrupted views of the View cinema? Are many millennials waiting for something that might never arrive? Well, I think it's so important that we address this truth, this reality head on, that many millennials and younger generations are sat there probably silently thinking, I'll get an inheritance one day, versus many parents looking at it going, I'm probably going to need to spend a lot of this money to live, is because studies have shown that those who expect an inheritance change the way they save and spend. Our modelling finds that for 1980s born, the bottom fifth of households by lifetime income effectively spend 11% of their inheritance in advance of receiving it, whereas the top fifth by lifetime income spend 33% in advance. 31% of people between 25 and 45 say the inheritance they expect has put them off saving to live life for now. We already know that people tend to get less than they expected and later in life than they expected. So when these expectations don't meet reality, when people have consciously or subconsciously already spent some of the money before they get it, what do we think happens when their expectations aren't met? Well, things get ugly. You specialise in disputes around inheritances.
Yeah.
How busy are you at the minute?
We're very busy. Yes, families have always fought, but the combination or the perfect storm, if you like, of certain factors is going to make claims just carry on and on and on.
What you're looking at here is the cause for one of the oldest known inheritance disputes in history. Well, actually, no, this is a print screen that I've then slapped on some paper, printed out, dipped it in coffee and burnt the edges. Year 6 history coming in strong. Anyway, ancient Mesopotamia, around 4,000 years ago, 3 brothers, because of this document, argue over a house, orchard, some slaves, bronze items and furniture. Disputes over what is fair are as old as civilization itself. But what's changing is, in the past really, inheritance was a feature of the few. Only the rich really got one, and as such, disputes were limited.
Well, I am king.
In recent decades, getting an inheritance went mainstream. And now today, many people who receive one might be the first person in their whole family history to ever get a meaningful inheritance. You could be the first person in your whole bloodline to get one. And that means a rise in the amount of disputes. The number of claims issued at court rose by over 5% between 2023 and 2024 and is set to continue increasing. Just consider the complexities of modern families, blended families, where a person might have, multiple marriages, kids with each, got a couple of stepkids that you can throw into the mix as well. And you can see how this inheritance thing can become fractured and complex. We know that people are counting on this money.
We, the generation, wait.
So when proper preparations aren't made or expectations don't meet reality, families fall apart quickly. Every family says, oh, not my family, we're thick as thieves. But arguments about inheritances are all too common. The first step to all of this is one of these. This is my will. Until recently, I was part of the 51% of people in the UK who didn't have one. All of that changed for me when I was on a night out in Manchester and I got sucker punched in the side of the head when I wasn't looking by a complete stranger. I was only trying to tell the guy about my love life. But anyway, that interaction with that stranger taught me one thing.
Chat shit, get banged.
I joke because it helps me cope with the trauma. But after the event, one of the first things that I did was I got a will. And honestly, I found it one of the most life-affirming events. One of the best things that I've ever done in terms of my own happiness, because I now know that if I die, the people I love know how much I love them. I would encourage you to write a will. They don't cost that much to do. And if you feel it's appropriate, I would also encourage you to sit down and talk to the people in your will about why you're making the decisions that you are. Many of the disputes post-death are born from the fact that the one person with all the answers is already gone. If you can't face having that conversation, or it's not appropriate for you to have it now because you're worried that it might cause issues in the family, just leave clear reasoning within the will as to why you've made the decisions that you have. I also think that if you're a child watching this, then approaching a parent about your will is a great way to start the conversation about inheritance. Go to your parent and say, look, I'm writing my will for the first time. Can I ask your advice on it? How have you structured yours? Could you be a trustee of mine? You know, how should I think about this? And do you have any advice for me? People love those kinds of questions. And it just gets the conversation going without being as abrupt as, you know, how much money you left me. Okay, let's get another story from Martin.
We had two brothers, and it was a very straightforward estate. There was arguments about lifetime payments. It wasn't much. And in fact, both lawyers, I was in one room as a lawyer in the other room, trying to understand what the hell was going on. Why were these two brothers? They wouldn't even move towards each other. Really hostile, really aggressive. So we brought them into the same room, and the mediator just said to the pair of them, "What's going on? What is it?" And it was quiet for about 5 minutes. And then one of the brothers jumped up, pointed at the other one and said, "You don't understand. You got the red bike. I had to have the yellow one."
You're joking.
And then the brother stood up and the other brother went, "But I wanted the yellow one."
It's 4,000 years later and brothers are still fighting about what is fair. This leads me on to my next point. So much is said about boomers versus younger generations. But what about it not being about parent versus child, but child versus child? And I don't mean sibling-based rivalry. He's got more than me and all of that. I mean generational inequality. 94% of the wealthiest fifth of households expect to leave a bequest, compared with just 44% of the bottom fifth. As a result, home ownership is taking on an increasingly hereditary quality. Dr. Elizabeth Philby, in her excellent book called Inheritocracy, discusses this, and at the core of her point is an argument that's put forward by economist, I think his name is Peter Turchin, that you can summarise it like this. When the rate of return on capital outpaces economic growth, inequality becomes more and more entrenched. The UK is a depressingly great example of this. So economic growth since 2008 has stagnated. So the wages of workers and their ability to build significant wealth has also stalled. But asset prices have risen, benefiting those who hold lots of assets. I'm not here to get all Gary Stevenson on you.
I say tax the rich.
But the point of this video is to promote conversation around this idea and topic of inheritance. I have no real answers, but I do see both sides of this debate. I want to live in a system where it pays to work hard and that chances of upward mobility are not dictated by who your parents are. We also, though, shouldn't shame parents or kids who get support or, provide support. At the end of the day, it's a parent's job to provide support to their kids in many forms, isn't it? I just want to acknowledge, though, that this point of this growing influence in this country of life outcomes based on who your parents are. I think if we don't discuss this, we're at risk of alienating those who don't receive this. And if we don't look for ways to address it, there's just going to be further division within this country. The last time inheritance was this defining to life outcomes was in the time of Dickens and Jane Austen. Both had inheritance as key themes in their writing, and both were critical of the structural unfairness that it created. Throughout the early 20th century, we had the introduction of state pension, free healthcare, free schooling, and post-war, there was building of lots of affordable housing. A lot of the wealth that we're discussing today that's going to be part of this great wealth transfer was a result of these systems. And these are the same systems that today, as inheritance is becoming more and more of a factor in life outcomes, appear to be falling apart. I don't think that that's a coincidence. Right, I think now is an appropriate time to talk about tax. Inheritance tax is at or near the top when it comes to the most hated taxes in the UK. And most polls point to the UK public being in favour of scrapping it. I think central to this is this idea of unfairness, that you've already paid all your taxes on it and then, you've got to pay tax on it again. You would think then that this is a tax affected millions of Brits a year, such as the disdain. But the latest figures show us that only 4.39% of estates have an inheritance tax bill. That's between 2021 and 2022. It's around 27,800 estates. Remember, an estate could have a couple in it. And I think one of the reasons that this tax is so disliked is the amount of people who are set to pay it is going to rise. The proportion of deaths resulting in an inheritance tax bill is set to grow to over 7% by 2032-33. As of February 2025, the current inheritance tax rules are as follows. You can pass on £325,000 without tax. This is called the nil rate band. But you also get a nil rate band of £175,000 on your main residence when it's passed to a direct descendant. When these allowances are combined for a married couple or civil partnership, they can reach up to £1 million tax-free. We know that the majority of wealth is held in homes, and we also know that the majority of inheritances are closer to 50k. So this is actually a pretty large allowance, and it's why the majority of estates don't pay the tax. Anything above the thresholds is taxed at 40%, and then transfers between spouses and civil partners are exempt. So who is paying the tax then? This table from the IFS shows the average effective tax rate, the green line, paid by different size estates that owe tax, the values of which are along the bottom. This is only estates that actually have a tax bill. All the ones covered by the allowance of up to 1 million quid are not on this graph. And due to those allowances, none of the average estates actually pays 40% on the total. On estates where the tax bill and the estate value is below 1 million quid, the effective average rate never exceeds 15% of the total pot. It kicks up hard after 1 million, as this is where the allowances don't cover you anymore. You actually start to lose the nil rate band for your family home after you cross over 2 million quid. But even on a £3 million estate, the average tax bill is 25%. That's high, but it's not 40%. The most mental thing though is beyond 5 million it falls away. Why? Because estates of this size have the resources to avoid the tax altogether. Grosvenor Estate, I'm looking at Hugh. The use of trusts, gifts, and ownership of things like agricultural land, as well as a load of other structures that, I won't be aware of. The extremely wealthy use these tools to basically reduce their tax burden or just completely avoid it altogether. So actually, in the UK, inheritance tax is a system whereby the majority pay nothing, those with 2 to 5 million at death feel the biggest percentage burden overall, and those with above 5 million, especially those over 10 million, can decide if they want to pay it or not. But the point does stand that more people will pay this bill in the coming years than have in the past. Labour froze the inheritance tax thresholds. This is a form of fiscal drag. By holding the allowances at the current rates, as inflation pushes up asset prices long term, more and more estates will be caught by the tax, even if in real terms their wealth hasn't increased by the same amount. They also added pensions into the mix, which were previously exempt. So by including these into the calculation, more and more estates are going to be pushed over the top threshold. And the reforms to agricultural land, which was targeted at those wealthy who purchased farmland as a tax dodge,
not having to pay inheritance tax,
means that many genuine farmers will now be caught out as well. If you see these changes as fair or not will depend on your perspective of this, on what you do. I mean, farmers are going to hate them, of course. But for the majority of the UK population, for now, this remains a tax that most won't pay. But it does speak to the importance of correct estate planning. You and your loved ones can benefit from the same structures as the rich, potentially. You can give assets to children. You get to bask in the glory of being an absolute legend and doing so, and it prompts this conversation around inheritance. Just make sure you don't die within 7 years, and also make sure you don't give too much. Also, this trust thing, I'm not completely clued up on this, so please seek the advice of a good solicitor. But I see it as a great way to kind of raise this discussion again about family. Often, as I said before, discussion around inheritance can feel morbid and like you're wishing your family members dead. Instead of discussing then from the perspective of death, why not talk about making them immortal? So, for me, I'm going to open a family trust. I'm going to place assets inside of it. It won't be like, the Grosvenor estate, but there'll be something in there. And then I'm going to provide strict rules around who can access it and how much they can take out a year. It's going to be like, you can take 3% and nothing more. Let that thing then run through the generations and make sure every time someone gets a payment out of it, there's just a picture of me there, like, you're welcome. But speaking to your family about legacy is a lot more palatable than talking to them about death and taxes. When we hear the words great wealth transfer, the expectation is that trillions will flood down into the hands of every millennial or young'un in the country. But the reality is likely going to be very different.
An inheritance is many things, but at its core, it's an act of love. And as such, speaking about it should be seen as a positive thing. I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a sibling, so I have all the perspectives on this. And I want my parents to enjoy their life, free of the burden of responsibility of looking after me. I want to know that me and my siblings aren't going to fall out over money one day. And I want my son to live his life and not wait for me to die before that happens, before he realises that I spent it all on Madry and soaking up the views of the Marina Lake and Matalan. I know these conversations aren't going to be easy, but surely it's something that's worth talking about. Thank you.